Every Elder Scrolls game gives you a new hero with a new destiny, but they all share one thing in common. They lived through events that would shape their politics forever. So today we're figuring out which side of Skyrim's civil war each protagonist would actually choose based on everything we know about them. And the first one isn't even a contest. The Eternal Champion. This is the easiest call on the entire list, and it's not even close. The Eternal Champion, born in 3E 370, was a former apprentice of the sorceress Rhea Silmani and the protagonist of the very first Elder Scrolls game, Arena. Their whole deal, their entire reason for existing in the narrative is one thing: saving Emperor Uriel Septim VII after the Imperial battle mage Jaeger Tharn trapped him in another dimension. That's the plot. That's the game. Go rescue the Emperor. And this wasn't a quick weekend trip. The Imperial Simulacrum lasted 10 years from 3E 389 to 399. For an entire decade, Jaeger Tharn impersonated the Emperor while the real one rotted in an alternate dimension. The Eternal Champion spent their adventure tracking down the pieces of the Staff of Chaos across all of Tamriel, fighting through every province specifically to undo a usurper's illegitimate rule and put the rightful Emperor back on the throne. So when you ask this person, hey, would you support a guy who killed the High King and started a rebellion against the Empire? The answer is obviously no. The Eternal Champion is an Imperial loyalist by job description. Their defining act is literally restoring legitimate Imperial authority. Ulfric Stormcloak's entire movement is built on the idea that the Empire has lost its way, that it's weak, that it bowed to the Aldmeri Dominion. And sure, there's a version of the argument where the Eternal Champion looks at the modern Empire and says, this isn't the institution I fought to preserve. That's fair. The Empire of the Fourth Era is not the Empire of Uriel Septim VII. But here's the thing. The Eternal Champion's instinct, their proven instinct, is to restore authority, not fracture it. When they saw a broken empire, they didn't start a revolution. They fixed it from the inside. They put the real Emperor back on the throne and called it a day. Ulfric's approach is the exact opposite of everything the Eternal Champion demonstrated. You don't spend a decade reassembling a magical staff across an entire continent to save your Emperor and then turn around and support the guy trying to tear the Empire apart. That's not how that works. The Eternal Champion sides Imperial. Zero hesitation, but the next protagonist on our list, their loyalty to the Empire gets a lot more complicated. The Agent. Now, the Eternal Champion picked the Empire out of pure loyalty. No hesitation, no conditions, no fine print. The Agent from Daggerfall? Same pick, completely different energy. See, the Agent wasn't some wide-eyed hero who stumbled into saving the world. They were a close personal friend of Emperor Uriel Septim VII. Not a servant, not a soldier, not some errand runner who got lucky. A friend. Someone the Emperor trusted enough to send into the Iliac Bay region, which at the time was basically a political minefield where every faction wanted to stab every other faction, sometimes literally, and the Agent thrived in it. This is someone who spent their entire adventure navigating competing kingdoms, brokering deals between groups that hated each other, and somehow walking away from all of it alive and with more allies than enemies. They're arguably the most politically savvy protagonist in the entire Elder Scrolls franchise. The Eternal Champion saved the Emperor because it was the right thing to do. The Agent would save the Emperor because they'd already calculated 3 moves ahead and figured out why it was the smart thing to do. So when it comes to Skyrim's civil war, the Agent sides Imperial. But here's the thing. They're not doing it because they believe the Empire is some shining beacon of justice. They're doing it because a unified Skyrim is strategically more valuable than a fragmented one. A broken Skyrim is a vulnerable Skyrim, and a vulnerable Skyrim is basically a gift basket for the Aldmeri Dominion. The Agent would see that immediately. But here's where it gets complicated. The Agent would also privately agree with about half of what Ulfric is saying. The Thalmor have too much influence. The Empire's concessions after the Great War were embarrassing. The White Gold Concordat was, to put it politely, not ideal. The Agent would nod along to all of that. They just wouldn't be stupid enough to think secession is the answer. If anything, the Agent would probably try to use the Stormcloak Rebellion as leverage. Look, the Nords are furious. Maybe we should renegotiate some terms before this gets worse. That's the Agent's whole playbook. They don't pick fights, they pick positions. And their position would be standing firmly in the Imperial camp while quietly sliding a list of demands across the table. Their loyalty to the Empire isn't blind faith, it's a calculated investment in the side most likely to survive long term. And honestly, that might be the most dangerous kind of loyalty there is. Because the Agent wouldn't just fight for the Empire, they'd fix it, whether the Empire wanted fixing or not. But if you think a political operator is interesting, wait until you meet a literal reincarnated god who couldn't care less about either side, the Nerevarine. Now this is where things get interesting, because for the first time, the answer isn't obvious. The Nerevarine is the reincarnation of Indurald Nerevar, the legendary Dunmer war leader, and the protagonist of Morrowind. Born as a prisoner on a certain day to uncertain parents, fulfilling an ancient prophecy that the Dunmer had been waiting on for centuries. And what did the Nerevarine do with that destiny? They united the great houses and Ashlander tribes, killed Dagoth Morgoth-Ur and dismantled the entire tribunal, 3 living gods who had been running Morrowind's spiritual and political life for thousands of years. Let me say that again. The Nerevarines' crowning achievement was walking up to the existing power structure and pulling the plug on it, not reforming it, not joining a better version of it, ending it. So when you ask which side of Skyrim's civil war the Nerevaran would pick, the honest answer is neither, and I can prove it. Look at what both factions actually represent. The Empire is centralized institutional authority demanding loyalty in exchange for stability. The Stormcloaks are a nationalist movement built around one man's claim to power, operating through military hierarchy and regional control. Both of them are exactly the kind of old order power structures the Nerevaran was literally prophesied to move beyond. Tullius and Ulfric would look like two sides of the same coin to someone whose entire existence was defined by transcending institutional frameworks. Here's the thing, the Nerevarine didn't save Morrowind by picking a side. The great houses were fighting each other. The Ashlanders hated the settled Dunmer, the Tribunal was lying to everyone, and instead of choosing which faction deserved to win, the Nerevarine said none of you are the answer and forged an entirely new path. That's a fundamentally different energy from someone like the Eternal Champion, who saw a broken system and wanted to fix it. The Nerevarine saw a broken system and replaced it. Now, if you put a sword to their throat and force them to choose, there's a slight lean toward the Stormcloaks. The Nerevarine was an outsider who arrived in Morrowind as a prisoner and ended up liberating an entire civilization. There's a natural kinship with Nordic independence aspirations, with the idea that a people should determine their own fate rather than answer to a distant authority. That resonates, but Slightlean is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. The Nerevarine would never actually commit to Ulfric's command structure. They wouldn't take orders from Galmar's Stone Fist. They wouldn't swear oaths to a Jarl who thinks shouting someone to death counts as legitimate political succession. The Nerevarines' entire spiritual identity is built on moving past exactly that kind of thinking. More likely, the Nerevarine would show up in Skyrim, take one look at the war, and walk directly into the nearest Dwemer ruin to study something actually interesting, which is, extremely on brand, but if you think someone sitting the war out is anticlimactic, wait until you hear what the Champion of Cyrodiil would do with this conflict, the Champion of Cyrodiil. This one's not even a debate. The hero of Kvatch spent their entire career watching what happens when central authority collapses, and the answer is demons, literal demons, pouring out of flaming portals across the entire continent. That kind of experience changes a person. The Champion of Cyrodiil is the protagonist of Oblivion, and their whole deal was saving Tamriel during the Oblivion crisis. When the Septim bloodline was severed and the barriers between worlds started failing, Oblivion gates opened everywhere. Cities burned, people died. The fabric of reality itself started coming apart at the seams, and the Champion was the one running from gate to gate, closing them, fighting Daedra, and doing everything in their power to restore legitimate imperial authority before the entire world ended. So when Ulfric Stormcloak stands up and says the Empire is weak, we should break away, the Champion of Cyrodiil hears something very different from what everyone else hears. They don't hear a freedom fighter, they hear the opening line of a catastrophe. Here's the thing, the Champion didn't just fight for the Empire because it was convenient, they fought for it because they watched the alternative play out in real time. No Emperor, no Dragonfires, no barrier between Nirn and Oblivion. The chain of authority broke and the sky literally opened up. That's not a metaphor, that's a Tuesday in Cyrodiil circa 3E 433. The Champion has what you might call a visceral, borderline traumatic attachment to the concept of institutional stability, which is, not ideal for someone trying to evaluate Ulfric's arguments on their merits. And that's exactly why they'd side Imperial without hesitation. The Champion's entire worldview was forged in a crisis caused by fractured authority. Every instinct they have screams that unity is survival and division is death. Ulfric's rebellion, no matter how valid his complaints about the Thalmor might be, represents exactly the kind of fracture that the Champion spent their life trying to prevent. Now, to be fair, there's a counter-argument worth addressing. The Champion dealt with existential supernatural threats, and the Aldmeri Dominion's creeping influence over the Empire could be seen as a similar kind of corruption. A slow-burn version of the Oblivion crisis, where instead of Daedra pouring through gates, Thalmor agents pour through embassies. The Champion might recognize that pattern, they might even agree that something needs to be done about it. But here's where their instincts kick in. The Champion's demonstrated preference across the entire Oblivion crisis was to work within existing structures. They didn't overthrow the Empire to fix it, they didn't start a revolution. They found Martin Septim, the legitimate heir, and helped him restore proper authority through proper channels. Even when Imperial leadership was compromised, even when things looked hopeless, the Champion's answer was always reform from within. Never burn it down and start over. That's the fundamental disconnect between the Champion and the Stormcloaks. Ulfric looks at a compromised empire and says tear it apart. The Champion looks at a compromised empire and says fix it. Two completely different philosophies born from two completely different life experiences. And the Champion champion's experience involves having personally witnessed the apocalyptic consequences of option A. So the champion of Cyrodiil goes Imperial. Confidently, immediately. Probably while giving Ulfric a very long, very tired lecture about structural integrity and the importance of not shattering the one institution standing between Tamriel and whatever existential threat shows up next. But if the champion's experience taught them anything about keeping empires together, wait until you hear about someone who had to stop an entire plane of oblivion from merging with reality, the Vestige. The Vestige is, without exaggeration, the weirdest protagonist in Elder Scrolls history. This is a person who had their soul literally ripped out of their body by Molag Bal, the Daedric Prince of Domination, and left with nothing but a remnant, a vestige of what they once were. They are technically not even fully mortal anymore. They're a being caught between two planes of existence referred to as the Soulless One, and they spent their entire adventure stopping Molag Bal from merging all of Nirn with Oblivion in a catastrophic event called the Plane Meld. And they won. They beat a Daedric Prince. They saved the entire continent from being absorbed into a hellish dimension of eternal suffering. They became Meridia's champion, the hero of Cold Harbor, the savior of Tamriel. And even after reclaiming their original soul at the end of it all, the game still treats them as fundamentally different from every other mortal walking around. You don't get your soul ripped out by a Daedric Prince and come back normal. That kind of thing leaves a mark, which is, not ideal. So now imagine asking this person to care about Skyrim's civil war. Here's the thing. The Vestige would almost certainly refuse to pick a side, but not for the same reasons as the Nerevarine. The Nerevarine transcended the question philosophically. The Vestige just wouldn't notice it was happening. When you've personally punched a god in his own realm and stopped the literal fabric of reality from collapsing, a regional border dispute between some angry Nords and a stretched-thin military garrison registers somewhere between mild inconvenience and not my problem. It's like asking a nuclear physicist to settle a neighborhood HOA dispute about fence heights. They could, technically, they just have absolutely zero reason to care. And the Vestige's divine entanglements make things even messier. They've been Meridia's champion, they've been involved with multiple Daedric princes and cosmic entities across multiple storylines. Their loyalty card is already punched in about 6 different directions, none of which involve General Tullius or Ulfric Stormcloak. Committing wholeheartedly to either faction would require the Vestige to ignore every cosmic obligation they've accumulated, and those obligations involve beings who can unmake reality. Ulfric can shout really loud, Daedric princes can devour souls for eternity, the priority list kind of writes itself. But let's say someone held a sword to their throat and said pick one. Hey Vestige, Stormcloaks, or Empire, right now, no walking away. Surprisingly, they might lean Stormcloak, not out of deep political conviction, not because they've studied the White Gold Concordat and have strong opinions about Talos worship, but because the Vestige is, at their core, a fundamental outsider. Their very existence defies every conventional category that Tamriel uses to sort people, mortal but not mortal. Had their soul stolen by a Daedric prince, but fought back and won it. Alive but technically shouldn't be. Someone like that might feel a quiet kinship with other outsiders resisting centralized authority, with people who looked at the established order and said, no, actually, I don't think this works for me. But even that alignment would be tissue paper thin. The Vestige would fight one battle, get bored, remember they have literally world-ending threats to worry about, and wander off to do something cosmically important. Ulfric would be mid-speech about Nordic freedom, and the Vestige would already be in another province dealing with an Oblivion portal. Where'd they go? I don't know. Something about a god. Which god? They didn't specify. Some people are just built for bigger problems. But if you think the Vestige is hard to pin down, wait until we get to the one protagonist who actually lives in Skyrim during the war and still can't make up their mind, the Dragonborn. Every single protagonist on this list has a backstory that points them in a direction. The Eternal Champion served the Emperor. The Agent was his buddy. The Nerevarine had a whole prophecy to deal with. But the Dragonborn? The Dragonborn is a ghost, a blank page, a character with zero predetermined personality, zero established relationships, and zero prophecy telling them which political faction deserves their loyalty. And that's not an accident. That's the entire point. See, the last Dragonborn, the Lot Dovahkiin, is the only protagonist on this list who actually has to make the Civil War choice in-game. Everyone else we've been speculating about, running through their backstories, weighing their values, making educated guesses based on what we know about them. But the Dragonborn? They literally walk up to a table and pick a side, or they don't. Both are valid options the game explicitly supports. Here's the thing about the Dragonborn that makes them fundamentally different from every other entry. They have the inborn ability to learn and master words of power faster than any normal mortal could dream of. Regular people need years of dedicated training just to learn a single word. The Dragonborn absorbs them like breathing. They're powerful enough to defeat Alduin, the World Eater, a dragon literally prophesied to destroy everything. They can bend reality with their voice. They are, by almost any measure, the most powerful individual walking Skyrim at the time of the Civil War, and the game still doesn't tell them which side is right. A Dragonborn who values restoration and stability looks at the Empire and says, yeah, we need to stay unified against the Thalmor. Fracturing now is suicide. A Dragonborn who values self-determination looks at Ulfric and says, these people deserve to worship who they want and govern themselves. A Dragonborn who values peace above all else walks into the season-unending negotiations and forces both sides to sit down and shut up long enough to deal with the actual dragon problem. All three are equally valid. The game supports every single one without judgment. That's what makes the Dragonborn the most honest answer on this list. Every other protagonist, we can make a case, we can point to their history, their loyalties, their defining moments, and say with reasonable confidence where they'd land. But the Dragonborn is deliberately designed to resist that analysis. They have no history pushing them toward the Empire. They have no cultural ties demanding Stormcloak loyalty. They're whatever you decide they are, and if you think that's a cop-out, it's not. It's actually Bethesda's most mature design decision in the entire franchise. Think about the progression. In Arena, the Eternal Champion has a clear mission: save the Emperor. There's no political ambiguity. In Daggerfall, the agent has more freedom, but still operates within Imperial frameworks. In Morrowind, the Nerevarine follows a prophecy that, while open to interpretation, still channels them towards specific outcomes. In Oblivion, the hero of Kvatch serves the Septum line directly. Each game gradually loosened the reins on protagonist agency, giving players more room to define who their character was and what they believed. Then Skyrim arrives and says, here's a civil war. Both sides have legitimate grievances. Both sides have serious flaws. You have the power to end this conflict single-handedly. What do you believe? No guidance, no canonical answer, no developer winking at you through dialogue to suggest one faction is secretly correct. Just a choice that reflects your values projected onto a character with none of their own. The Dragonborn doesn't choose the Stormcloaks or the Empire, you do. And the fact that millions of players have spent over a decade arguing about which side is right proves that Bethesda succeeded. They created a political conflict compelling enough that people genuinely care, and ambiguous enough that nobody can definitively win the argument, which is, exactly how real political conflicts work. But we've gone through every protagonist now, from the Eternal Champion all the way to the Dragonborn themselves. So let's stop speculating about individuals and actually settle this thing, the verdict. So after all that, we've got our answer. Kind of. The Eternal Champion sides with the Empire because they literally built their legacy restoring Imperial authority. The Champion of Cyrodiil does the same because they watched what happens when central power collapses and Oblivion gates start popping up like weeds. The Agent leans Imperial too, though they'd probably spend the entire war quietly negotiating better terms behind closed doors. The Nerevarine looks at both factions, shrugs, and walks into the Ash Wastes without a word. The Vestige does roughly the same thing, except they walk into a different dimension entirely because they've got Daedric Prince problems that make Skyrim's politics look like a disagreement at a town hall meeting. And the Dragonborn. The Dragonborn is you. That's not a cop-out. That's the entire point. Here's the thing. Bethesda didn't accidentally make the Civil War hard to resolve. They engineered it that way. The Stormcloaks get legitimate grievances about cultural suppression, foreign interference, and a ban on religious worship that would make anyone furious. The Imperials get legitimate arguments about unity, stability, and the fact that a fractured Tamriel is exactly what the Thalmor want. Both sides get sympathetic characters. Both sides get moments that make you uncomfortable. Neither side gets to be the obvious hero. And that's not lazy writing. That's the hardest kind of writing there is. If one faction were objectively correct, your choice wouldn't matter. You'd just be following the clearly marked path to the good ending, like picking the blue wire in a movie where someone already told you it's the blue wire. The reason the Civil War still generates arguments over a decade later is because it genuinely resists resolution. People who pick the Stormcloaks aren't wrong. People who pick the Imperials aren't wrong. They're just revealing what they value more: self-determination or institutional stability, cultural identity or continental unity, freedom now or security later. These aren't video game questions. These are real questions that real civilizations have been fighting over for thousands of years. And they don't have universally correct answers. They never have. That's what makes the exercise we just did so interesting. Lining up 6 protagonists against this conflict doesn't produce a clean scoreboard. board, it produces a spectrum. Loyalists on one end, transcendent cosmic beings who couldn't care less on the other, and a blank slate Dragonborn sitting right in the middle, reflecting whatever you brought to the table when you started playing. The Dragonborn has no canonical backstory, no predetermined allegiances, no prophecy that says and then they pick the blue team. Every other Elder Scrolls protagonist carries enough established history that we can make educated guesses about their politics. The Dragonborn carries nothing. They're a mirror, and so is the Civil War itself. When you walked into that recruitment office in Windhelm or Solitude, you weren't making a choice the game wanted you to make. You were making a choice that revealed something about how you see authority, freedom, tradition, and compromise. The game didn't judge you for it. It just let you live with the consequences and move on to fighting dragons. That's rare. Most games with faction choices eventually tip their hand. One side gets the sympathetic music, the other gets the menacing lighting, and you figure out which ending the developers actually wanted you to pick. Skyrim never does that. Tullius is rigid, but reasonable. Ulfric is passionate, but flawed. The Thalmor are manipulating everyone, and neither faction has a clean solution to that problem. So no, there's no definitive answer to which side each protagonist would choose. And that's not a failure of analysis. That's the highest compliment you can pay to how the conflict was designed. The Civil War works because it was built to be argued about, not solved. It's a question that tells you more about the person answering than about the game asking. And honestly, that's better than a right answer. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.